Hello and welcome to Speed Bumps with Charlie Kimball. I'm your host, Charlie Kimball. Today we have an extraordinary guest. He is a pilot. He also has type 1 diabetes, Austen McDonald. Austen isn't just a skilled aviator. He's a true trailblazer in the aviation world, navigating the skies while living with type 1 diabetes. His journey is a testament to resilience, determination, proving that challenges can be transformed into stepping stones for success. Today, we'll dive into Austen's inspiring story, from his early passion for flying to the innovative ways he manages his diabetes in the cockpit. He'll share some of the lessons he's learned, the hurdles he's faced and overcome, and how he's helping pave the way for others with diabetes to pursue their dreams in aviation and elsewhere. Whether you're an aspiring pilot, someone like me who has their private pilot's license, someone living with a chronic condition, or just looking for some motivation to overcome your own speed bumps, you won't want to miss this conversation. So strap in as we take off with Austen McDonald and explore how he's reaching new heights, one flight at a time. Austen, thanks for joining us.
Charlie, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So where, when, how did you fall in love with aviation? You know, when did you catch that flying bug?
The best way I can describe it is it runs in my blood, literally. My dad is a professional aviator, has been for his whole lifetime, and I grew up in an aviation household. So he, when I was a child, he was in the airlines, but before that, he was a military aviator with the Royal Canadian Air Force. And so growing up in the house, having airplane models and pictures of airplanes and hearing stories, and then all of his friends, naturally, I would hear airplane stories growing up, and the sense of adventure and the cool lifestyle is kind of what drew me to it.
Okay. And so did you always want to be a pilot? Was that something, with it being in your blood? For me, same way in racing. My dad worked in racing. I remember seeing parts of race cars, designs of race cars. We used to watch the race on the Formula One on Sunday morning to see if I could see my dad at the track. So racing was always a passion and sort of turned into a dream. Was being a pilot always in the cards for you?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a family business that has a couple of airplanes. So first couple of rides I took in an airplane was with our family business, and I was hooked from there. But no, from day one, I wanted to be a pilot, and I wanted to follow my dad's footsteps and join the Air Force and hopefully fly fast jets, and then eventually end up at the airlines. So no, it's been there probably since I could walk and talk is when I wanted to become a pilot.
Well, and that dream kind of hit a speed bump. I mean, the podcast is called Speed Bumps. We're going to talk about some of the hard challenges. But when were you diagnosed with type 1 diabetes? What does that story look like? And how did that change your vision for you as a future aviator?
For me, it was grade 9. I'm just trying to make sure the years are right. 2011, I was 14 years old. And it's kind of a funny, saddish story. I was playing a lot of sports growing up, trying to stay fit so I could be in shape for the military. And I was playing indoor soccer here in the frigid cold of Edmonton, Alberta. And before going to the soccer game, I get in the car with my mom, and she looks at me funny, and she goes, "Have you been, sniffing nail polish remover?" And I look at her and go, "What are you talking about?" "No, I'm, straight-laced, don't do any of that stuff." And so she kind of hums and haws, and we drive to the soccer game, play a full game. I even scored a goal. But right after that goal, I got to the bench and immediately passed out. And came to a few seconds later, but the coach saw it and kind of gave me the side eye as well. And after the game, mentioned something to my mom, and then my mom, we went out for lunch, and she said, "Yeah, I heard you kind of passed out on the bench." I said, "Yeah, I was feeling fine." And then all of a sudden, out like a light, and she started to connect the dots in her mind. She's a dentist, is her job. So she has medical training and has seen diabetics, and she started to connect the dots. And she goes to me in the car as we're driving, I think you might be a diabetic. And hearing that from my mom was an immediate shot in the chest, because growing up, I knew that there was very limited subset of healthy parameters you had to be in order to become a pilot, especially in the military. So hearing that, I knew immediately that I was potentially, very much ineligible to be a professional pilot and a professional aviator, albeit wasn't officially diagnosed at that point. But still, that's kind of the primer that had me thinking about, my trajectory may have been altered here. So we eventually, the next day, she kept me out of school. We went to do a few tests at a few doctors, see a few doctors, and a few of them were wondering if I was on drugs because I had exhibited the signs that similar to drug usage. Lost a lot of weight, was very pale and gaunt, extremely dehydrated, and it got to the point where my mom was almost pleading with them, please just poke his finger, like take a blood measurement. She had even gone to a pharmacy and asked if she could just buy a blood glucose meter over the counter so she could do it for me. Eventually all these doctors sent me home for the afternoon and said, we'll call you. And nothing that evening. My mom, still being the persistent protective mother she is, took me to another physician, and he's joking around with me, and he's, looking me over, and he goes, yeah, you may have found the discovery of weight loss. You're just drinking a lot of water and you're losing a ton of weight. And my mom goes, look at his tongue. It's shriveled, and smell his breath. Looks, smells, and he's like, I'll be back in a minute, and goes to the back room, scurries back, and he says, don't go home. Go straight to the emergency department. Your blood sugar is 33 millimoles per liter, which I'm not sure what the conversion is to your guys' unit system, but essentially a type 1 diagnosis. And that's kind of how my journey started, is 2 days of kind of going, is this what's going to happen next?
Yeah, I recognize those millimole numbers because I was diagnosed in the UK while I was racing over there, and same thing, like the number popped up, and I think I was 27.7 or something. So not quite as high a number as yours, but still really scary. And same thing, the doctor's like, okay, don't go home, go straight to the ER, let's get admitted, like IV fluids, insulin, all of that right away. And so you're in that doctor's office, right? You get some premonition of that diagnosis coming towards you because of your mom, right? She understood, she had some medical training. You talk about that shot in the chest, knowing that you couldn't be in the military with diabetes. How did you process that? Like, do you remember the mindset? Obviously your blood sugar is really high, and we know as people, members of what I like to call the cool kids club, having diabetes, we know when our blood sugar is really high, we're sort of foggy, and it's hard to focus, and feels like maybe you're running through molasses a little bit. Do you remember anything specifically when you get that specific diagnosis and that clear understanding that you now have diabetes and the military is off the table? Do you remember how that felt and what your mindset was in that specific moment?
Well, I'd almost break it into two moments. So my mom insinuated that I was going to potentially have this diagnosis. It was kind of a fight or flight, kind of very much I felt like, my future, my plans was under attack. So I was kind of like a, shock, startle, kind of denied it at first. And, all of it, I cried a bit in the car trying to come to grips with it. And then after that, you're right, like the high blood sugar feeling of being foggy and not knowing what's going on. That's what felt like the next few days. So from the official diagnosis to when I first saw the support worker. So in Canada, we have an inpatient program where you get diagnosed, you're taken in for a few days to get your blood sugar stabilized. And then we have what I think they still call it to this day, diabetes school. So it's 2 weeks of going into the university hospital here at Edmonton, and you meet with social workers, you meet with nurse practitioners, you meet with doctors, explaining the disease and the implications and kind of the not just the medical side, but also the social side. And so I remember distinctly being in the social worker's office and saying, they come up to me, they had no idea what my career plans and anything like that were. And I remember her looking at me and going, diabetes isn't that bad of a diagnosis. It's fine. You can do almost anything you want in the world nowadays with diabetes, especially here in Canada, except serve in the military and be a professional pilot. Right? Like just the two things. Yeah. So I felt that again. But funny enough, I don't want to toot my own horn much when it comes to this. In that moment, I'd known that I couldn't be a pilot, but coming into that conversation, but it kind of flipped a switch for me where, I kind of changed as a individual. In that moment, a switch flipped, and basically I decided that I would make the most of my diagnosis and try to do more, even though I couldn't on paper. Does that kind of make sense? So my initial way of of thinking was, well, if I can't fly them, I'll design them. So that kind of kicked off where I wanted to go in education. I was only in grade 9, but I wanted to pursue a degree in engineering. And so I could work for companies like Boeing or Airbus or Pratt & Whitney in Canada here that designs engines. So our Bombardier is essentially our version of Boeing. So that kind of kicked off I don't want to call it a coping mechanism, but almost a pivot in my attitude of, well, if I can't do this, I still want to be involved in aviation, and I have means to scratch that itch and be around airplanes. It'll just look a little different.
I tell you, that this gives me goosebumps, Austen, because all through high school, for me, I was racing cars, racing go-karts, doing pretty well, but I always focused on school, and maybe more so than other drivers, with the idea that if I couldn't drive cars for a living, I wanted to get into a university, get a degree in engineering so I could design them. I'd fallen in love with racing and wanted to be a part of that world, that industry, that sport, one way or another. So you're saying this, and it's like I'm hearing my own self speak, a few years ago and talk about it. Okay, if I can't fly them, I want to design them. I still want to be a part of aviation. For me, it's if I can't drive race cars for a living, I want to design them and still be at the racetrack. So that really resonated. Like it really struck me how similar that mentality was. And so you go to college, you go to university, you get your degree in engineering. And where in this process, do the regulations change or continue to evolve as far as empowering commercial airline pilots with type 1 diabetes to still be able to fly? Because I imagine it was partly your growth and age, maturity, development, education, but also the understanding and the reduction of the stigma around diabetes and health in general from whatever your version of the FAA is. Here in the US, it's the Federal Aviation Administration. I don't know if it's Transport Canada or whatever that is in Canada. Those regulations must change about the same time you change and grow and evolve to a point where they align for you to continue to pursue that dream. Do I have that right, or how does that look?
It's a long story is the best way I can put it. So I went to university, and you're right, it's Transport Canada is our equivalent of the Federal Aviation Administration. I went to university, I pursued mechanical engineering with the aerodynamics mindset. At the same time, I was still working for a family consulting business who, for the large part, it's an aviation consulting business, but there's aviators in it that work for us. And one of them was stepping away from the business, because he was busy with family in Toronto, and he was a pilot for Air Canada as well as my dad. That's how they got to know each other. And so as he was stepping away, he was telling me all the cool, fun adventures he had flying the airplane he was flying. And that kind of reignited my desire for it, to come back or to try to, maybe challenge the government. And so that happened along the same time as my dad, who is also flying professionally at the same time. He actually flew with a type 1 diabetic, a gentleman by the name of Stephen Steele. And so what the rules were in Canada at the time is that if you had a professional pilot's license, so either airline transport license or commercial license, and then you were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, you could return to work if you had proven that you met the control regime and everything like that. But there was a strict prohibition on anybody with type 1 diabetes entering the industry. As I'm sure you and many of the listeners are aware, most diabetics are diagnosed in that juvenile stage. So before you even had a chance to attain a commercial license. So it was this weird situation of, he had met somebody with type 1 diabetes that was flying. I was hearing, how good flying was from a peer of ours. And you think to yourself, like, if he can do it, why can't I? So we dug more into the regulations, and that's when we found out, the prohibition on you have to have had it to retain it for type 1 diabetics flying aircraft. So had a conversation with my dad, and I'll mention my dad a lot. He is the single reason why I have a license and I'm able to pursue my dreams. He helped fight for me. I did my best to maintain my blood sugars, and he pick the fight with the government. So I'll mention him a lot, but we decided, how can we do this? How can we change it? So while I was in university, he was pressing the individual, Stephen Steele was his name, who had his commercial or his airline transport license with type 1 diabetes, on who to talk to. How do we go through the hoops? How do we prove that in theory, there's no difference between myself and him on a clinical basis? And that's kind of the impetus of how that started. And I'm not sure how deep you want me to go into how everything came together.
Well, I'm really curious, like, what was the perspective that it, as far as Transport Canada or the government regulations, regulatorily wise, I'm not sure that's a word, but we're going with it. What was the difference between him, who had a commercial license and still had to manage his blood sugars, and you, who had diabetes and had to manage your blood sugars as you work towards your commercial license? I think I struggle to see the rationale that makes those two use cases different.
To answer your question, we didn't either, right? And talking to my endocrinologist, he was a specialist in diabetes. As far as he was concerned, there was no difference either, right? And so that was essentially the impetus of our case with transport is, well, tell us, show us, prove to us that there is a difference. And essentially they couldn't, is what it boils down to. And in Canada, our version of I believe it's the Constitution, your guys' equivalent, is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And there is a specific clause in there, an article that states you cannot discriminate based on ability and health. So in other words, if there's no real valid reason why you're denying it, you have to allow it. And that was the fight we got in with Transport Canada. I shouldn't say fight. It's more of the probing and the questioning and essentially trying to move government to make change for the better. And I can understand it from their aspect too. Not well-controlled diabetics are a risk. But if you can exhibit good control and maintain a positive relationship with your diabetes and your control of your blood sugars, there's no reason why you can't attain a pilot's license and be a commercial pilot. So all while I was going through university, I was still fighting. I was still doing a fight on the side kind of thing and kind of hedging my bets about, do I pursue engineering? Do I pursue flying? And I decided to, at the very least, finish my engineering degree off. But it was around my last year of my degree is when I finally got that letter in the mail saying, you did it. Good job. Here's your restricted class 1. I believe you guys call it class 1 medicals. Ours, or is it, class or category? Ours is category. So here's your category 1 medicals.
Oh, amazing. That you're continuing to go through college while you're trying to change the big machine that is the federal government and Transport Canada's perspective. And I can imagine, just like for me in motorsports, it took a team, right? It's not just you writing like your representative, not like you're just calling the general number, the front desk of Transport Canada and saying, hey, I want a class 1 so I can go fly, for Air Canada or for whomever. Who was the biggest members of the team? You talked about your mom when you were diagnosed. You talked about your dad as a pilot. You talked about Steve Steele as a pilot. Who else? Your endocrinologist. Is there anyone else I'm missing that really was in your corner? And I know it doesn't sound like it was a knockdown, drag out brawl of a fight, but it was. Anytime you enact change like that, I believe it can be contentious, right? It's much easier for them to say, here are the regulations, go pound sand, leave me alone. As a government agency, we're just trying to enact these regulations rather than trying to change them. So there's some contentiousness to it. Who else was a part of that team and was in your corner that you look back now every time you get to throttle up and lift off into the sky carrying passengers from wherever to wherever with that Air Canada logo on your chest? Who do you look back and are like, without them, I'm not sure I get this done?
Are you ready for my Oscars acceptance speech and all the people I'm going to thank? Basically, yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
I don't mean to miss anybody. I'm going to go through it in my head. First and foremost, like I mentioned many times, with my family and my dad. Number one, he was the champion of getting this and helping me attain this. So my dad, my mom, even my sister, who would put up with a lot of the frustrating events in my life and having to play in second fiddle, right? Because when you have a diagnosis like this, the siblings sometimes put aside. So I have to give her credit too. Stephen Steele being the trailblazer he was for essentially doing what we did, but back in the 90s, and fighting the hardest fight, in my opinion. Next, I would have to say my endocrinologist, Dr. Peter Sr. at the University of Alberta, for providing not only any letter I asked for in terms of attesting my control and my attitude with diabetes, but also providing clinical evidence that, nowadays with the treatment methods we have, there's no reason why a person with this level of treatment can attain this safely. And then a unique character that I love chatting to anytime I can is George Canyon. I'm not sure if you've heard of George. He's a country music singer here in Canada, and he is a honorary colonel in the Canadian Air Force for his work with type 1 diabetes in the community. So he himself is a type 1 diabetic, and he attained a private license before I'd attained my commercial. And he was the one that actually set us up with meetings with individuals in the government to kind of facilitate moving this in. You're right. It's very much a team. We had a team of people and individuals that were motivated and willing to say good things about me. True, albeit, but say good things about me to help further this case and change it for more people to come after me. So George Canyon, can't say enough. And I have a funny story. He came on my first flight as a commercial pilot, actually. So I have a couple good pictures with George there. Next, I would have to say I believe he's retired now from Parliament, but the Minister Mark Garneau, he's actually a famous Canadian astronaut, and he was the person that first met with us to discuss, he was the Minister of Transport at the time. And he met with us to essentially hear our argument and hear the argument of Transport Canada, his employees essentially, and determine whether or not this should be resolved or dealt with. And very patient, very intelligent individual who sat with us and heard both sides of the argument. And at the end of the meeting said, I don't see any reason why we should be prohibiting individuals like Austen from attaining commercial license in Canada. And that's essentially set off the pathway of us changing these regulations. So if it wasn't for the transport minister at the time, Mr. Mark Garneau, I don't believe we would have got anywhere as far as we did with the government, or at least it would have taken a lot more of an uphill battle to do so for sure. And then also, I don't mean to forget anyone, my nurse practitioner, Lisa Thomas, she was amazing, always there for me, gave me great tips on diets and different technologies that are coming out. So like you said, very much a team, and I hope I'm not missing anybody. I've named a lot of people, and I know there's some that I probably have missed, but Diabetes Canada being another sponsor to help us. But no, it was very much a team effort. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit. Trying to make sure I don't forget everybody. Just kind of like an Oscar speech, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And don't worry, there's no shepherd's crook we won't bring the music up and rush you off stage. The couple of things that really strike me in that list is it's very, very similar to my healthcare team, right? When I was racing and had to sort of convince the IndyCar Medical Board of my safety and health within the race car. When you're doing 230 miles an hour, 345K, 350K an hour, it's pretty fast. And it's not just you on the racetrack. If something goes wrong, if your blood sugar drops or you have an issue, there's 32 other drivers during the Indy 500 that they have to protect as well. And so I had my endocrinologist on speed dial. I had my diabetes educator ready to go. I had my food logs. I had my blood sugar logs. I had my continuous glucose monitor logs. All of these things ready to go. And amazingly, all of the champions you talk about that help support it and take meetings, right? Even just pick up the phone, email you back and say, yep, understand, let's talk about this. And how interesting to have an astronaut, someone who has gotten to live the joy of aviation to the point of spaceflight, to sit down and talk with you about your passion, your dream, and how that moves forward, right? And how and have some intelligence and rationale around setting up the regulations, right? Because it's not just, yeah, you're good, move on to the next guy. It's, you have to figure out how to set up the framework so that it continues to stay safe. So it continues to keep the door open for the next generation. Because just like myself, I'll ask you, when you go fly, do you think about the next generation of pilot with type 1 diabetes that you could be keeping the door open for going forward?
Absolutely. I feel like I hold a responsibility to be an example of what to do, hopefully, and how to essentially maintain a safe atmosphere. And also so that, for example, another individual comes after me, flies with somebody I flew with. They don't go, oh, another diabetic pilot, that's going to be a pain in the butt. I don't want that. I want them to be like, oh, cool. I know Austen. I flew with Austen. That's kind of the attitude I want of educating people along the way as providing a doorway to open for type 1 diabetes. I mean, I'm sure you've come across this point a lot in the podcast. We have to educate quite a bit and remove stigma ourselves. And so that's kind of what I look at it doing, is part and parcel keeping the door open, but also educating a bit for the person that doesn't know what diabetes is or thought, it's one ham and cheese sandwich you have to eat at noon or else you're going to pass out in 3 hours, right? Being able to kind of provide more context to what we live with.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity and can, like you say, be quite a responsibility. So talking about ham and cheese sandwich while you're flying, what tools do you specifically use within the cockpit to stay safe within those regulations that you share with us? And I will preface this with, I always hated this question when I got asked it because everyone's different, right? I will be the first one to say everyone's diabetes is different. Everyone's lifestyle is different. Everyone as a pilot is absolutely different. Your personal experiences craft you as an individual and as a pilot. But within those boundaries, what do you use and what do you find really effective? Open that cockpit door for us a little bit, I guess.
So for me, it's a combination of things. So when I first started flying, I was flying regional flying out of Vancouver. So very much within an hour and a half flight, same time zone. But now I'm doing transcontinental stuff. So I'm going far away. So my diet is quite sporadic. Sleep patterns are quite sporadic as well. So the patterns have changed and I'm still adjusting them. Like if you ask me about probably a year and a half from now, I'll say some things that are probably slightly different than what I'm saying now. But the most important thing that I have to say is a CGM. I believe you cannot be a properly functioning diabetic, especially in aviation, unless you have a CGM, because it provides such a context of data that you can use either retroactively or going forward to ensure that you're within regulation of flying an airplane. The next obvious point to that is a way of administering insulin, and that is my insulin pump. So I got my Dexcom on here today, and then I got my Omnipod on here today. But essentially, those are the two tools I use directly in terms of providing boluses, providing basal rates, even to when I'm going to work. I have preset tolerances and ranges on my insulin pump that essentially keeps me within the specific set of ranges that Transport Canada wants me in, as well as a buffer on top of that. So for example, here in Canada, the acceptable range of flying for blood sugar is between 6 and 16 millimoles per liter. Again, not sure what the US equivalent of that is. But essentially I have it so that my target is between 7.5 and 10 on my insulin pump. So essentially it keeps me within a very specific range so that I have a bit of tolerance for going up and down. In terms of if I deviate from that, I always carry candy on me when I go flying. It's Fuzzy Peaches is my favorite low glucose snack. I'm not sure if there's a US equivalent to that. Essentially these peach flavored candies. And And then also the nice thing about airline flying is, I'm sure if you've flown on airplanes before, there's a cart full of pop and snacks. So worst case scenario, you can always ask one of the flight attendants to bring me a Coca-Cola or an orange juice. And that always, that fits the bill as well. But essentially there's a saying in flying, I'm sure you've heard it before, is the 5 Ps: prior planning prevents poor performance. So having the CGM and knowing your patterns and having a routine essentially prevents you from having to use the what you need to keep yourself in range. In other words, the glucose snacks or bolusing to bring you back down.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, the 5 Ps you talk about, not just in your health management, but one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard as a pilot is never fly the airplane anywhere your brain hasn't been before. So don't get somewhere that you haven't thought about. And it's very much the same thing with diabetes management. And for me in the race car, 100% the same way. I spent a lot of time thinking and working ahead so that when I got on the track, I was ready to go. And all I had to think about was doing the job, because I'd already thought about how my body was going to adapt and adjust. And I just had to check in every now and again. And you talk about the millimole blood glucose number. So to convert millimoles per liter, according to the internet, to milligrams per deciliter, which is what we use here in the US, you multiply it by 18. So you talk about 6 to 16. 6 is about 108. And then 108 to, a little bit more than that. Math in my head, I'm okay at, not great at. But that's a very similar range to what I used to like to be in the race car. In fact, you talk about adding a buffer on top. I used to do the exact same thing. You know, I worked with an exercise physiologist. I spoke to him on the podcast earlier in the season, Dr. David Ferguson, and he said, your ideal blood sugar is 147.832. And I went, yeah, okay, that's not realistic. But I created kind of a buffer and went, okay, well, about 150 to 175, which is, you know, up to about 10 millimoles, is a really good number for me to perform and be safe above and safe below. It's amazing how adding in the third dimension of flying still sounds very similar to what I did in the race car with 2 dimensions at a very similar speed. Maybe not quite as fast as you go through the air, though.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is, I mean, it's curious or very cool to hear that, you know, in your work, it's very similar. Like, it is truly, you know, just the third dimension difference. Altitude's no big deal. It's, as you've learned, it's just another dimension. But genuinely, you were moving fast. We got to make decisions on the fly, which requires our brains to be properly fueled by glucose. The principles are all the same.
Yep, absolutely it is. Okay, so what advice do you have for aspiring pilots, both with and without diabetes? Like, if you take off your diabetes advocate hat for a second and say, okay, I'm a commercial airline pilot for Air Canada, flying transcontinental. I think you mentioned before we got going that you're flying a 777. You know, it's a big, complex aircraft. What advice do you have for someone who's like, I'm going to go take a discovery flight in a little single engine airplane and see if I like it?
Patience and consistency. That to me is the most important part of what I do, is that to have the patience to not get frustrated off the bat about something you either don't understand or something that's getting in the way. You need to essentially just take a step back and think about what you need to do and how it needs to be done. And then the consistency is not just throwing your hands up in the air and saying, I'll get it next time. It's no, you got to work at it and continue to work at it. And funny enough, that's the same advice I give with diabetes, is patience and consistency, because we're human, right? We make mistakes. We're not perfect. Blood sugar, you can do the same thing 2 days in a row, but our blood sugar could be completely different, right? So patience and consistency is the best advice I can give. And then third last little piece, I'd say I'm at a bit more of a nostalgic point. I left flying regional on the Dash 8, which I love and I miss it very much. Enjoy the moment that you're in. You know, even though you're maybe, you know, starting out at the very basic flying a 172 or a Cetavria and feeling, oh, I can't wait to fly a 777 one day. Enjoy the ride. Take a step back, smell the flowers, look outside, enjoy the view, because when you get to the 777 level and you're taxiing by either a 172 or a Dash 8, you go, man, I missed that. I remember that time that I was doing that. I wish I spent more time in that seat just taking it in. So patience and consistency, and enjoy the moment.
What great perspective. Great perspective. And so now, you're there. You're flying transcontinental airplanes. What do you love most about your job? What piece gets you up in the morning and gets you out on, and sometimes those frigid mornings in Alberta over the winter, to go to work? What do you love the most about what you're doing right now?
I have a bit of an engineer brain in the sense that I always feel like I need to be challenged. I need something to be different. I need something to overcome, like a goal puzzle kind of thing. And the cool thing about flying is, and I'm sure you've learned this already, no flight is ever the same. And no flight will ever be perfect. There will always be something at the end you debrief and you go, yeah, I could have done that better, or that landing wasn't perfect, or I didn't put the right inputs for this. Always having something to work towards is essentially what I typically see as what gets me out of the morning, is that I need something to do. The brain needs to continue working. So that, and then I have to admit, the sound of the GE90 777 engines is a pretty cool sound, especially coming from an engineer's perspective. So, sitting in the seat and feeling the power is pretty cool.
Oh, fantastic. Now, here on Speed Bumps, I ask my guests the same 3 questions each and every episode. So I'm going to start with you, Austen. What's the best advice you've ever received, and from whom?
Oh, I'm going to sound like a broken record. It was patience and consistency. I hate to say that isn't an original line for me. It was a strength and conditioning coach I had when I was playing competitive rugby, from Lindsay Marteri, it's the fella's name. And I was getting frustrated with not being able to do a certain lift at the weights I used to be at. And he said to me, patience and consistency. And ever since, I even heard that before I decided to pursue flying again, but I adopted that in my journey towards flying airplanes. And it was hands down the best advice I've ever received in my life.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Number 2, what's been the coolest personal interaction you've had with someone? As a racing driver, we got to meet celebrities, other professional athletes. I've talked to some people who've had world-class politicians come through their offices. What's been the coolest where you look back, or even in the moment, you go, I can't believe I get to hang out with this guy? Will Power went to dinner with Slash, right? So I think that's a pretty high bar, and I don't expect that. But what's the coolest interaction you've ever had, either at your job as a pilot, or just as you've gone through life?
You know what? I'll have to say that my first flight, like I mentioned earlier, I said I was going to come back and tell the story. My first flight flying professionally as an airline pilot, I had George Canyon on my flight. He booked I think it was 5 a.m. ticket from Calgary, Alberta to Saskatoon and back, just to be on that flight with me and be a part of, the first person with type 1 diabetes to get a commercial license to do their first flight. And so as cool, he told me he was going to come and everything like that. And as cool as it was, I was laser focused on what I needed to do, the job at hand. But after the first flight, he came and patted me on the shoulder and said, "Great work, Austen." And the training captain I fly with looks to his left and goes, "Was that George Canyon?" He's a country music fan. And I go, "Yeah, it was George Canyon. He came on the flight today." The captain knew I was a diabetic,
Yeah.
and this was a kind of a big deal. And he goes, "Get him back up here." And so we may have delayed the flight. Don't tell my boss, but we delayed the flight a little bit, just having a conversation between the two of them there. And then I was able to get a good picture with George and everything like that. So I have to say, knowing that was going on in the background, but focus on what I did, and then even to have the person that's training me go, "Oh no, wait, that's really cool. Let's take a minute and enjoy this." That was a pretty cool interaction.
That's awesome. What a cool moment to look back on, especially at such a big milestone in your career, right? Your first commercial flight, and for your training captain to be like, "Wait, you know that guy? Wait, get it back up here. Let's talk some more." Okay, I'm a car guy, and I know you're an engineer. So what's your dream car? Do you have it? Do you have a plan to get it? Or is it always just going to stay a dream sort of on the pedestal?
I like to think of things. I have a nominal goal and I have a reach goal. What I really want to aspire to. And I'll start with the nominal one. I always loved the E39 M5 by BMW. So between about 1996 and 2003, I just love the way that car looks. I had an E39 earlier, but it was a 528 model, so not as big of an engine, only 200 or 180 some horsepower instead of 400. So I'm looking at some on Facebook Marketplace and a few other places, so stay tuned. I might be driving one of those soon. But I was also a big James Bond fan growing up, so an Aston Martin DB9 in silver would be perfect.
Fantastic answers. Absolutely great answers. James Hinchcliffe, I think it was mentioned that he loved the McLaren F1, the sort of center seat with passengers next to him, very race car. Great answer, though, with the E39 plus, having the James Bond connection with the Aston Martin DB9. Great answers all the way through. Austen, this has been an absolute pleasure. I was excited for this as, to hear your story as a trailblazer within aviation. I love that when we were talking before we got started, you said, congratulations on your private pilot license. It's a license to learn. I'm sure you're finding that out. And I think so much of our conversation today, I have felt like I've learned a lot from you, and that everybody with diabetes, it's a great reminder, we continue to learn, right? That the patience and consistency that you bring to flying, you bring to education, you bring to weight training back when you were playing rugby, and to your diabetes management, all works really well towards success. And despite the speed bumps that life has thrown at you, you've overcome them and are still getting to fly your passion and live your dreams. So thank you very much for coming on. And I may reach out to you to see about getting Stephen Steele on the show to talk about his experience years ago.
Absolutely. I'll give you Stephen's contact, but I also want to say thank you, Charlie. This was a ton of fun. I really enjoyed this. And it's cool to hear somebody who has very parallel experiences, essentially trailblazing and having to fight for what you want to do. It's cool to know that you're not alone, especially in the disease we share. So no, thank you. It's been fun.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Austen. And we'll see you in the skies. Fly safe, stay healthy, and we'll talk to you soon.
See you soon, Charlie. Take care. Thanks.